Turn the car around now. Those words came out of my mouth with such force that my husband nearly swerved off the highway. We were somewhere in upstate New York, maybe an hour from the Canadian border, when every instinct in my body started screaming that something was terribly wrong. "Ruth, what's happening?" my husband asked, already pulling over to the shoulder as cars whooshed past us, their headlights flashing like warnings in the dark. My hands were shaking as I stared at the innocent-looking overnight bag sitting in our back seat. Just minutes before, my son Brandon had called me. His voice, unusually sweet, asked about that exact bag. The way he said, "I love you," before hanging up, it was the tone, almost desperate, that made my blood run cold. In 42 years, that boy had maybe said those words to me a handful of times, and never, ever during a casual phone call. "Something's not right," I whispered, my heart pounding as I continued to stare at the bag. The words felt heavy, as though they carried a weight that I couldn't quite comprehend. "We need to turn around right now," I repeated, my voice trembling. My husband didn't hesitate. He looked at me with the trust he'd shown for all 50 years of our marriage. He didn't ask questions. He didn't argue. He just waited for a break in traffic and made a U-turn that probably saved both our lives. What I discovered in that bag changed everything I thought I knew about my own son and the family I'd been supporting for years. What they had planned for me, what they were willing to sacrifice to solve their money problems, was so devastating, so unthinkable, that even now, months later, I can barely believe my own child would put me in such danger. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how we ended up on that highway, with me shouting at my husband to turn around before we crossed an international border, I need to tell you about the 5 years that led up to that moment. 5 years of generosity, sacrifice, and love, things that my son's family had taken completely for granted. You see, I'd been helping them financially ever since Brandon lost his job. Month after month, year after year, I had been their safety net, their solution to every crisis. And they repaid that kindness by planning something so shocking, so criminal, that even now, months later, I can barely believe my own child would put me in such danger. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how we ended up on that highway with me shouting at my husband to turn around before we crossed an international border, I need to tell you about the 5 years that led up to that moment. 5 years of generosity, sacrifice, and love, things that my son's family had taken completely for granted. You see, I'd been helping them financially ever since Brandon lost his job. Month after month, year after year, I had been their safety net, their solution to every crisis. And they repaid that kindness by planning something so shocking, so criminal, that it could have destroyed my entire life. Let me start from the beginning, and you'll understand exactly why those 3 words, "turn the car around," were the most important I've ever spoken. Before we dive deeper into my story, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and subscribe to the Never Too Old channel. We're creating a community of incredible women who know that our best chapters can happen at any age. Now back to the story. My name is Ruth Henderson. I'm 68 years old and I live with my husband of 50 years in our cozy 3-bedroom home in Albany, New York. We raised 3 children here. And after decades of working as a school secretary, I retired with a modest pension and some savings we'd carefully built up over the years. Life was good, peaceful even. That is until 5 years ago, when everything changed for our son Brandon's family. Brandon had been working as a warehouse supervisor for nearly 15 years when the company suddenly downsized. Just like that, at 42 years old, he found himself out of work with a wife, Amber, and their 3-year-old son to support. The job market was brutal, and even when Brandon did find work, it was always temporary positions that paid far less than what he had been making. As his mother, how could I just stand by and watch my son's family struggle? I couldn't. It started small, a couple hundred here and there to help with groceries when things got tight, gas money so Brandon could keep looking for work, but then their landlord raised the rent and they couldn't make the difference. What was I supposed to do? Let my grandson get evicted? Of course not. Before I knew it, I was covering most of their major expenses every month. Their rent, car payments, insurance, utilities. I was even buying all the groceries and paying for my grandson's daycare so Amber could work her part-time job at a nail salon. "Mom, I promise this is just temporary," Brandon would say every time I handed him another check. "As soon as I get back on my feet, I'll pay you back every penny." Amber would nod along, though I noticed she never seemed quite as grateful as Brandon. Sometimes I'd catch her rolling her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking or making little comments about how some people have it easier than others. But I pushed those feelings aside because family helps family, right? And oh, how I loved spending time with my grandson. I was babysitting him almost every weekend, taking him to the park, reading him stories, spoiling him the way grandmothers are supposed to do. Those moments made every sacrifice worth it. My husband would sometimes worry that we were giving too much. "Ruth, honey, we need to be careful about our own retirement," he'd say gently. But I couldn't bear the thought of my grandson going without. Besides, we were managing just fine on our pension and Social Security. The years blended together like that. Brandon would find a job, lose a job, find another one that didn't pay enough. I kept writing checks, kept covering their shortfalls, kept being the reliable safety net that held their whole lives together. By the time my grandson started school, I realized I'd been supporting them for almost 5 years straight. Not occasionally, not just in emergencies, but consistently, month after month. They never had to worry about making ends meet because Grandma Ruth was always there to fill in the gaps. I thought I was being a loving mother and grandmother. I thought I was helping them get through a rough patch until they could stand on their own 2 feet again. But what I didn't realize was that somewhere along the way, my generosity had stopped feeling like a gift to them and started feeling like an obligation. They'd gotten so used to my support that they began to expect it, to plan their lives around it, to see my money as their money. And when I finally, for the first time in 5 years, said no to one of their requests, well, that's when I discovered just how much my own family truly valued me beyond my bank account. Last January, everything changed with one phone call. My grandson had been attending the local public school elementary school, and by all accounts, he was doing well academically. But Amber got on the phone and painted a completely different picture. "Ruth, he's being bullied constantly," she said with dramatic concern. "These kids are so cruel, making fun of his clothes, excluding him from everything. The teachers don't care, and the class sizes are huge. He comes home crying almost every day." My heart immediately went out to my grandson. What grandmother wouldn't be devastated hearing that her precious grandchild was suffering? "There's this wonderful private academy across town," Brandon jumped in. "Small classes, excellent anti-bullying policies, really individual attention for each student. It would solve all his problems." "That sounds perfect," I said, already imagining my grandson thriving in a better environment. "Well," Amber's voice got a little softer, "the tuition is pretty steep. It's about $15,000 for the remainder of this school term, and then it goes up to $18,000 annually after that." My stomach dropped. Those numbers were enormous compared to anything they'd ever asked for before. But then I thought about my grandson's tearful little face, and I almost said yes right there on the spot. Almost. "Let me think about it," I heard myself say. "That's quite a bit more than our usual assistance." There was silence on the other end. I could practically feel their surprise through the phone. "Mom," my son said slowly, "this is about your grandson's happiness and future. Surely that's worth any amount of dollars." For 3 days, I wrestled with the decision. My husband and I talked it through countless times. We looked at our budget, our retirement plans, our own financial security. The truth is, we could afford it, but it would mean significant changes to our lifestyle and future planning. But something else was bothering me too. In all the times I'd babysat my grandson recently, he'd seemed perfectly happy, chatty about his friends, excited about school projects, never mentioning bullying or problems. When I gently asked him about school, he just shrugged and said it was fine and went back to playing. Finally, I called them back. "I've thought about this carefully," I told Brandon and Amber. I love our boy more than anything, but I think we should explore other options first. Maybe we could meet with his teachers or look into the school's anti-bullying programs or even consider a different public school before jumping to private education. The silence that followed was ice cold. So you're saying no? Amber said flatly. I'm saying let's try other solutions first before committing to such a large expense. I replied, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. Unbelievable. I heard her mutter to Brandon, though she clearly meant for me to hear it. Some grandmother. The phone call ended shortly after that with promises to look into other options that I could tell they had no intention of pursuing. 2 months went by like this. 2 months of being shut out, of missing my grandson terribly, of wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. I started to... Within a week, everything changed. Suddenly, my weekend babysitting sessions were canceled. "We're busy this weekend" became the standard response when I'd call to ask about seeing my grandson. Family dinners at their house, which had been a monthly tradition, stopped being mentioned. When I'd call just to chat with my grandson, the conversations became awkward and rushed. "He's doing homework," or "he's playing with friends," or "it's not a good time," became Amber's usual responses. The worst part was running into them at the grocery store one afternoon. My grandson saw me and ran over with the biggest smile, throwing his little arms around my waist for a hug. But when Amber noticed, she quickly called him back with a sharp, "Come on, we need to go," and barely acknowledged my presence. My own grandson looked confused by his mother's cold behavior toward me. I could see it in his innocent little face. He didn't understand why Grandma Ruth suddenly wasn't welcome in their lives. For the first time in decades of providing assistance, I'd set one boundary, asked for one pause to consider alternatives, and this was their response. The message was crystal clear. My value to them was purely financial. The grandmother who had covered their expenses, watched their child, and been their safety net for half a decade was being punished for daring to say, "Let's think about this," instead of immediately writing a check. 2 months went by like this. 2 months of being shut out, of missing my grandson terribly, of wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. I started to question myself. Started thinking maybe I should just pay the tuition and get my loved ones back. That's exactly when they called with their sudden change of heart and the invitation that would lead us to that highway in upstate New York. Suddenly, after 2 months of silence, the phone rang. It was Brandon. His voice was brighter than it had been in weeks, many even months. "Hey, Mom, how are you and Dad doing?" he asked, with enthusiasm that immediately raised my suspicion. "We're fine, dear," I said, cautiously, still unsure what was behind this sudden warmth. "How's everything with you guys?" "Great. Actually, that's why I'm calling," he continued, and I could sense the change in his tone. Amber and I were talking, and we realized we've been too stressed about everything. We thought maybe it would be good for all of us to get away together, spend some quality time as a family. I didn't know how to feel. A part of me wanted to believe they were being sincere, but another part of me was waiting for the catch. My cousin has this beautiful cabin up in Quebec, right by a lake. She invited us all to come up for a long weekend. You, Dad, me, Amber, and our boy. What do you think? I wanted to say yes. I missed my grandson. I missed them all, despite everything that had happened. Maybe this was their way of apologizing, of repairing the rift. "That sounds wonderful," I said, softening. "When were you thinking?" "This coming weekend. I know it's short notice, but Amber's cousin just had a cancellation, and the weather's supposed to be perfect. It would be such a great opportunity for our boy to see his grandparents and for all of us to reconnect. For a moment, I let myself believe in the possibility of a happy family reunion, of putting everything behind us. "We'd love to," I said finally. "What can we bring?" "We're all set on the gear and everything, but, would you mind carrying one extra bag for us? Our car's packed pretty tight with the kids' stuff and fishing equipment. It's just a small overnight bag." Of course, I agreed. What grandmother wouldn't help carry a bag for her family? The night before we were set to leave, Amber dropped off the bag at our house. It was a standard black overnight bag. Nothing unusual about it. She was actually quite pleasant, chatting about how excited my grandson was for the trip and thanking us for agreeing to help with transportation. "He's been talking about seeing Grandma and Grandpa all week," she said with a smile that seemed genuine. "This trip is going to be so good for all of us." I went to bed that night feeling hopeful for the first time in months. Perhaps this was the opportunity for healing, for returning to the loving family we used to be. The next morning, we decided to take 2 cars since there was so much luggage, fishing equipment, and supplies for the weekend. My husband and I took our SUV with the overnight bag and some of the gear, while Brandon drove their car with Amber and my grandson following behind us. The drive started out perfectly. Our grandson kept waving at us from their car, and we'd pull alongside at red lights so he could show us his travel games and snacks. It felt like old times, like we were a close-knit unit again, with no walls between us. We'd been driving for about 3 hours, making good time toward the Canadian border, when my phone rang. It was Brandon, calling from their car behind us. "Hey, Mom. Hey, quick question," he said, and something in his voice immediately put me on edge. There was a nervous quality to his words, an odd tension that I hadn't heard before. "Yeah, honey? What's up?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "That bag Amber gave you, you've got it with you, right? It made it into the car?" His voice was anxious now, as though he was waiting for confirmation. "Of course it's right here next to me," I answered, still unsure where this was going. "Why?" "Oh, no reason," Brandon said quickly, though his voice remained tight. "Just making sure everything's secure for the border crossing. You know how careful they are nowadays." I could hear the sharp edge to his words. Something about it didn't feel right. And then, after a long pause, he said something that made my stomach drop. "I love you, Mom. You know that, right? I really, really love you." My son had never, in his entire adult life, called me just to tell me he loved me. Never. And certainly never with that intensity, that almost desperate tone. I hung up the phone, but my hands were trembling. Every maternal instinct I had developed over nearly 70 decades was suddenly screaming at me that something was terribly wrong. "Turn the car around now," I shouted to my husband. I could barely recognize the urgency in my voice. My body was shaking, my heart was racing, and I felt a cold, sinking sensation deep inside me. At the next exit, my husband pulled over, and while he kept everyone distracted, I quietly opened that innocent-looking overnight bag. What I found inside made my blood run cold. Carefully hidden beneath my grandson's folded pajamas and some of his favorite toys were small packages wrapped in plastic. Even at my age, I wasn't naive enough to not know what I was looking at. Drugs. A significant amount of them. My own son and his wife had planned to use me as an unwitting drug smuggler across an international border. They had counted on my love for my grandson, my desire to repair our relationship, and my complete trust in them to carry their illegal cargo without question. If we had been caught at that border, and with the way they were checking cars that day, we very well might have been. I would have been the one facing criminal charges. At 68, I would have been looking at years in prison for drug trafficking. And Brandon's phone call? That wasn't a simple check-in. That was him getting emotional because he knew he was about to destroy his mother's life to solve his own problems. The worst part was realizing that this entire reunion trip had been planned from the moment I'd said no to the tuition. The cold treatment, the sudden reconciliation, the urgent timeline, the cousin's cabin, all of it had been a carefully orchestrated plan to manipulate my love for them into committing a federal crime. As I stared at those packages hidden among my grandson's innocent belongings, I realized that my own child was willing to sacrifice everything, my freedom, my reputation, my entire future, rather than learn to live within his means or find legal solutions for his financial troubles. That was the moment I understood that the Ruth that had spent half a decade enabling and supporting them was gone forever. The Ruth that had spent decades making excuses for her son's poor choices had vanished in that moment of terrible clarity. My husband walked over quietly. "What did you find, honey?" he asked softly. I showed him the contents of the bag without saying a word. His face went white, then hard with an anger I'd rarely seen in our 50 years of marriage. "We're going home," he said simply. "Right now." From their car behind us, I could see Brandon getting agitated, probably wondering why we'd stopped. My phone started ringing again, but I turned it off. I couldn't bear to hear his voice, knowing what he had planned to do to me. The drive back to Albany was silent between my husband and I. But my mind was racing. Every moment of the past 2 months suddenly made perfect sense. The cold treatment after I'd refused the tuition, it wasn't punishment. It was preparation. They had needed to create distance so that when they suddenly invited me on this trip, I'd be so grateful for the reconciliation that I wouldn't ask questions. They had manipulated my love for my grandson, my desperation to repair our relationship, and my complete trust in them to nearly destroy my life. When we pulled into their driveway, Brandon and Amber were already out their car, looking confused and increasingly panicked. "Mom, what's going on?" my son called out as I walked toward their front door with the overnight bag. "Why did we turn around? We were almost there." I set the bag down on their doorstep and looked at my son. Really looked at him. When had he become someone I didn't recognize? When had his struggles turned him into a person willing to sacrifice his mother's freedom for his own convenience? I looked at my son, really looked at him for the first time in a long while, and something inside me shifted. He had always been my child, the boy I had raised with love, patience, and sacrifice. But now, standing there in front of me, he was a stranger. A man who had crossed a line so far beyond anything I could have imagined that I barely recognized him. When had he become someone I didn't recognize? When had his struggles turned him into a person willing to sacrifice his mother's freedom for his own convenience? I didn't wait for his excuses, for the explanations I knew would come. I just spoke calmly but firmly, feeling the weight of every word. "I know what's in the bag," I said quietly. The color drained from both their faces. Amber grabbed Brandon's arm, and I could see them exchanging panicked glances, trying to figure out what to say next. I knew it was too late for words, too late for apologies. "Mom, I can explain," Brandon began, his voice shaking. But I wasn't interested in hearing it anymore. The time for explanations had passed long ago. "No, you don't need to explain," I interrupted, my voice steady despite my trembling hands. "I know what's in the bag. You plan to use me to commit a federal crime. You were willing to let me face prison time to solve your financial problems." I could see them both visibly shrinking under my gaze. They knew they were cornered. There were no more lies they could hide behind, no more justifications for their actions. "It wasn't like that," Amber burst out, her voice breaking. "We were desperate. We owe people money, significant amounts, and they were threatening us. We thought if we could just make one trip." "You thought you could sacrifice me instead of dealing with your own choices," I finished for her. My voice was calm, but inside, I was shaking. I looked at my grandson, who was standing behind them, his little face scrunched in confusion. He didn't understand why his mother and father were so upset with Grandma Ruth, why his once warm and loving family had turned cold and distant in an instant. My heart broke for him. How could they do this to him? How could they put him in the middle of something so dangerous? "Listen to me very carefully," I continued, my voice growing stronger, though every word felt like it weighed a ton. "I will no longer be providing any financial assistance to your household. No rent help, no car payments, no groceries, no emergency funds, nothing." Brandon's eyes widened. "Mom, you can't be serious," he pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. "We depend on that support. We can't survive without it." I shook my head. "Then you'll need to figure out how to survive, won't you? The same way millions of other adults manage their finances without putting their mothers at risk for federal drug charges." The words stung. I didn't want to cut them off. Not completely. But what choice did I have? They had already crossed a line so deep, so unforgivable, that I couldn't keep enabling them. I turned away, walking back to our car, but Brandon grabbed my arm. "Please, just think about this," he begged, his voice cracking. "We made a mistake, but if you cut us off now, we'll lose everything. The house, the cars, everything." I gently pulled my arm free, looking at him one last time, feeling the pain in my chest. I had given them everything I had, but there was nothing left to give. You were willing to let me lose everything. My freedom, my reputation, my entire future. Now you'll have to face the consequences of your own choices. As I climbed into our car, I could see them standing in their driveway, staring after us, holding the bag that would never be opened again. Their world had come crashing down, and they hadn't even seen it coming. The drive back to Albany was quiet. My husband, who had always supported me no matter what, didn't speak much. We both knew there was nothing left to say. We had been through too much, and now it was time for me to take back control of my own life. When we pulled into our driveway, it felt different. It felt like something had been restored, even if I was still reeling from the betrayal. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, texts, and messages from Brandon and Amber. At first, they were angry, demanding to know why I had cut them off, why I had taken everything away. The messages grew more desperate, pleading for forgiveness, promising to make things right. I didn't answer any of them, not because I didn't care, but because I had to stand firm. I had spent so many years rescuing them from their own poor choices, and it had only enabled their destructive behavior. They needed to learn to stand on their own 2 feet.
Then came a call from someone I didn't expect, a woman I barely knew, Amber's sister. "Ruth, I think you should know," she said, her voice cautious. "Amber and Brandon are planning to try the Canada trip again, but this time they're planning to go themselves. They're desperate, and I'm really worried they're going to do something stupid." My heart sank. Even after everything that had happened, they were still willing to risk it all, putting themselves and their child in danger for the sake of a quick solution to their financial mess. Amber's sister went on. "They asked me to watch their son this weekend. They said they're going on a business trip for a couple of days." I could hardly believe it. After all we'd been through, after everything that had happened, they were still planning to smuggle drugs across the border. I immediately called my lawyer. He advised me to contact the authorities, but I couldn't, not yet. After everything they had put me through, I didn't want to be involved any more than I already was. That Saturday morning, while I was drinking coffee in the kitchen, the phone rang again. It was a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Ruth Henderson?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, this is she," I replied, a sense of dread washing over me. "This is Officer Martinez with U.S. Border Patrol. Your son, Brandon Henderson, and your daughter-in-law, Amber Henderson, were arrested early this morning attempting to cross into Canada with illegal substances. They listed you as the emergency contact." My hands started shaking, but not from shock. I knew this call was coming. They had crossed a line I couldn't come back from. "What about their son?" I managed to ask, my throat tight. "He's currently with a family member, but Child Protective Services needs to arrange proper placement. Since you're listed as next of kin, we'll need to contact you regarding his care." Within hours, I was filling out emergency custody paperwork. My grandson, confused and scared, came home with me that afternoon, carrying a small suitcase and his favorite stuffed animal. "Grandma Ruth, when are Mom and Dad coming back?" he asked, that first night as I tucked him into the guest bedroom that would become his room. "They made some bad choices, sweetheart," I said gently, my heart aching for him. "But you're safe here with Grandpa and me, and we're going to take very good care of you."
In the days that followed, life as I knew it changed dramatically. My grandson, still processing the whirlwind of events, found comfort in the simple routines I set up for him. We read stories together, something I had done for Brandon when he was small, and it brought a sense of normalcy to our otherwise chaotic lives. His schoolwork was another stabilizing factor. Each day, I watched him gradually settle into a routine, the tension from the last few weeks slowly fading from his demeanor. But for me, everything was different now. The phone calls from Brandon and Amber didn't stop. At first, they were angry, accusations, blame, demands that I help them. The usual pattern was there, the manipulation, the desperation. But as the weeks passed, their tone changed from angry to pleading. They started apologizing, promising to fix everything, to make it right. But every time I heard their voices, I could feel the weight of the betrayal, and I knew there was no going back. I didn't answer their calls. I couldn't. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and I wasn't willing to risk my freedom or my grandson's safety for their mistakes any longer. Brandon wrote me a letter from prison. It was full of apologies, full of promises to change. He spoke about how much he regretted the choices he made, how he wanted to make it up to me once he was out. The letter felt like a confession, a desperate plea to be forgiven, but I couldn't bring myself to read it more than once. Each word felt like a weight on my heart, a reminder of how far he had gone to manipulate me, to use my love and trust for his own gain. Amber's letters were different. They were full of complaints about prison conditions, how difficult it was for her to be away from her family. She reminded me that I owed them, that if I had just helped them one more time, none of this would have happened. I could barely bring myself to finish reading them. There was no remorse in her words, only self-pity and anger that I had refused to keep enabling them. The only thing that kept me going, that kept me from breaking under the weight of everything, was my grandson. He was adjusting, slowly but surely. He had begun to thrive in ways I hadn't seen when he was living with his parents. He had a sense of security now, something I realized he had never truly had before. No more uncertainty about whether the bills would be paid, no more fighting, no more fear of losing everything. It was just me, my husband, and him. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like we were a family again. I had set boundaries, tough ones. I had cut them off completely. And as hard as that was, I knew it was the right thing to do. I knew that by allowing them to continue to rely on me, I was only enabling their destructive behavior. They needed to learn to stand on their own, to face the consequences of their actions. But even with that certainty, the guilt lingered. Couldn't I have helped in some other way? Couldn't I have done more for them, for my son? But then I would look at my grandson, who was laughing as my husband taught him to play chess, and I knew I had made the right choice. He was safe now, he was loved, and he had a chance at a normal childhood, something that was stolen from him when his parents chose their own selfish path. It wasn't easy, this journey of setting boundaries, but as the weeks passed, I began to see the fruits of my decision. The peace I had been yearning for, the quiet stability was slowly becoming our new normal. We didn't have to walk on eggshells anymore, didn't have to worry about what tomorrow would bring. Then came the court date. Brandon and Amber had been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for their involvement in the drug trafficking scheme. Their house went into foreclosure, their cars were repossessed, their entire life, the life they had tried so hard to maintain with the help of others, was crumbling. And as hard as it was to watch, I didn't feel satisfaction. There was no joy in their downfall, only sadness that it had come to this. It was a strange thing standing there in court, knowing that my son, the boy I had raised, was now a convicted felon. I wanted to reach out to him, to tell him that I still loved him, that there was still a part of me that wanted to forgive him. But I knew deep down that forgiveness had to come with more than just words. It had to come with change, with responsibility, and with the willingness to face the consequences of his actions. Amber signed over temporary custody of my grandson to me, unwilling to risk him going into foster care. I didn't know what would happen when they got out of prison. Would they try to regain custody? Would they come back and try to manipulate me again? The legal battle over custody was looming, but for now, my focus was on keeping my grandson safe and making sure he had the childhood he deserved. In the months that followed, my grandson adjusted to his new life with us. He started at a new school, the same public school where I had once worked as a secretary. The teachers there remembered me fondly, and they went out of their way to make sure he felt welcome and supported. No expensive private academy was needed. He didn't need all the fancy programs and high-priced education. What he needed was stability, love, and a sense of security. And that's exactly what he got. He flourished. He became more confident, more at ease with himself. He made friends, and he began to excel in school. He became the child I knew he could be, the child I had always wanted him to be, but had been lost in the chaos of his parents' financial irresponsibility. At home, we spent our days together, doing simple things, cooking dinner, playing games, and reading. My husband taught him math and chess, and I helped him with his homework. Every night, we sat together in the living room, reading stories, the same way I had done with Brandon when he was small. And it felt right. It felt like healing. As for Brandon and Amber, they continued to write occasional letters from prison. Brandon's letters were full of apologies and promises to do better when he got out. Amber's were mostly complaints about prison conditions and reminders that I owed them for all the difficulties they were facing. But I didn't respond to either of them. There was nothing more to say.
My lawyers had advised me that when they were released, they would likely seek to regain custody of my grandson. We were already preparing for that legal battle, documenting everything: the stable home environment we had provided, the educational progress my grandson had made. But for now, our days were filled with school projects, weekend fishing trips with my husband, and quiet evenings reading together on the couch. My grandson was thriving in ways I never saw when he was caught in the chaos of his parents' financial irresponsibility. And I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, especially when it's coming from your own child. I'm 73 now, and I don't know how many more years I have left. But I know I'll spend whatever time I have raising my grandson to be the kind of man who solves problems honestly, treats people with respect, and never, ever asks someone else to pay the price for his mistakes. That's my story. That's how a grandmother's protective instincts and willingness to set boundaries saved not just her own life, but gave her grandson the stable childhood his parents couldn't provide. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say to people who take advantage of your generosity isn't, "I'll help you one more time." Sometimes it's, "I love you too much to keep enabling you." And sometimes that's exactly what the next generation needs to hear. So, that's my story. I'd love to hear what you think. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members who were taking advantage of your generosity? Let me know in the comments and subscribe for more stories like mine.
As the months passed, life settled into a new rhythm. My grandson, whose once confused face had been replaced with a growing sense of calm, was flourishing. He had found new joy in simple pleasures, and every day felt like a fresh start. It was hard to believe that only a few months ago, he had been caught in the middle of a whirlwind of lies, deceit, and turmoil caused by his parents' actions. But now he was thriving. He was becoming the child he was always meant to be. The house felt fuller, even in its quietness. We didn't need constant noise to feel alive, to feel like a family. It was in the small moments: dinner around the table, the sound of his laughter as he beat Grandpa at chess, the smell of books as we read stories together. It was in these moments I realized that we were healing, not just as individuals, but as a family. My husband and I had always known that life had its ups and downs, but we never imagined it would be our own flesh and blood who would put us through such an ordeal. But now, yet as difficult as it was, I could see now how this experience had changed me. It had tested my resolve, and it had forced me to confront uncomfortable truth about what I was willing to accept and what I could no longer tolerate. The weeks after the decision to cut off Brandon and Amber were tough, but every step forward was a testament to the boundaries I had set. It wasn't just about protecting myself, it was about giving my grandson the chance to build a life free from the chaos that his parents had created. The first few months were a blur of legal battles and paperwork. My lawyer worked tirelessly to ensure that my grandson would be safe in my care, no matter what happened in the future. Amber and Brandon, despite their initial attempts to reach out to me, continued their path down a destructive road, and it was clear they wouldn't change unless they faced the full consequences of their actions. I had learned to protect myself, not just from their manipulations, but from the emotional toll that came with enabling them. Every phone call, every letter was a reminder that the boundaries I had set weren't just for my protection, they were for my own peace of mind. There were days when the guilt gnawed at me. Was I doing the right thing? Was I too harsh? Should I have forgiven them and let them back into our lives? But as I watched my grandson's transformation, his smiles, his curiosity, the way he talked about school with such excitement, I knew in my heart that I had made the right choice.
The family dinners that we once shared were replaced with quiet nights of bonding, stories, and laughter. The dynamic had shifted, but in a way that made it stronger. I had come to realize that love was not about enabling destructive behavior, but about teaching responsibility and standing firm in the face of adversity. And then came the final confirmation that everything had shifted. A letter from Brandon came a few months later, shortly before his release from prison. This time, the tone was different. There were no excuses, no attempts to manipulate. He expressed regret, not for his situation, but for what he had done to me. He acknowledged how much he had hurt me, how his actions had jeopardized everything. He told me he had hit rock bottom and was trying to rebuild, trying to be a better man. I didn't know what to feel when I read it. Part of me wanted to forgive him, to believe that change was possible. But the other part, the part that had learned to set boundaries, the part that knew what it meant to protect my own well-being, knew that forgiveness would not come easily, not until he truly proved he had changed. And that was the key. Change had to come from him. It couldn't be handed to him. It had to come through hard work, through facing the consequences of his actions, and through rebuilding the trust that had been broken. It wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. It was about giving my son the opportunity to grow into the man I had hoped he would become, a man who could take responsibility for his actions and make better choices. As for Amber, I never heard from her directly again. The messages I received from her were always filtered through others, full of complaints and excuses. It became clear to me that she hadn't learned from her mistakes. She was still blaming the world, blaming everyone except herself for the situation she found herself in. I couldn't change her, and I couldn't change Brandon either, not until he was ready to take responsibility for his own life. But what I could do was focus on what was right in front of me. My grandson, the child who deserved a future full of hope, love, and stability. With each passing day, I found peace in knowing that I had made the right choice, even when it wasn't the easiest one. I had set boundaries not out of anger, but out of love, for myself, for my family, and for the future of my grandson. A few months later, I sat down with my grandson at the kitchen table, helping him with his math homework. We worked through the problems together, laughing at some of the tricky ones, celebrating when he got them right. "Grandma, I like it here," he said, looking up at me with those bright, trusting eyes. "It's quiet." His words hit me harder than I expected. They were so simple, but in them I heard everything I needed to know. "Yes, sweetheart," I said softly. "It is quiet, and sometimes quiet is exactly what we need." As I tugged him in that night, I realized that my decision had brought me more than just peace. It had given my grandson the childhood he deserved, and I had learned the hard way that sometimes saying no is the most loving thing you can do for someone, even if it's your own child. That night, as I sat in my quiet house, I finally understood. I had spent so many years trying to fix everything for my family, trying to make sure everyone was okay. But I had learned, through pain and heartache, that love doesn't mean fixing everything for someone else. Sometimes love means stepping back, setting boundaries, and trusting that they will find their way on their own. And that, I realized, was the greatest lesson of all. As the weeks turned into months, I began to notice something I hadn't anticipated. A shift in myself. The anger, the betrayal, and the overwhelming pain that had consumed me for so long began to dull, replaced by something I couldn't quite put into words. Was it forgiveness? Maybe, but it was more than that. It was peace. A deep, unshakable peace that came from knowing I had done everything I could to protect my family. And yet, the process of healing wasn't linear. Some days were easier than others.
Some days, when I least expected it, a wave of sadness would wash over me, thinking of Brandon, of the young boy he once was, and of the man he had become. There were moments when I would catch myself thinking, what if I had done more? What if I had seen the signs earlier? But then I would look at my grandson, who had come to feel so much like my own child, and I would be reminded why I had made the hard decision to walk away, to truly walk away from Brandon and Amber, even though it felt like I was abandoning the love I had for them. I was doing it to give my grandson the future he deserved, free from the chaos of his parents' poor choices. It wasn't long before I heard from Brandon again. His letters, which had once been filled with excuses and promises to change, now took on a different tone. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was real accountability in his words. He wrote about his time in prison, about the lessons he had learned, and about how he was finally facing the truth of his actions. The letter came one afternoon, just as I was sitting down with my grandson to help him with his schoolwork. I put the letter down, my hands trembling slightly as I read Brandon's words. Dear Mom, I've been thinking a lot about everything I did. The mistakes I made, the lies I told, and the way I hurt you. I can't ask for forgiveness, not yet, but I want you to know that I am truly sorry. I don't expect you to trust me again right away, but I promise that when I get out, I'm going to make things right, whatever that means. I'll do the work and I will earn back the trusts I destroyed. Please, I hope one day you can see that I've changed and that I want to be the man you raised me to be. Reading those words was like a weight lifting off my chest. Was it enough to erase everything that had happened? No, it couldn't. But for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, Brandon was beginning to understand the gravity of what he had done. I didn't respond immediately. The decision to forgive wasn't something I could rush. I needed time to process everything. His words, the pain, and the memories that were still so raw. But I didn't throw the letter away either. Instead, I folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. A part of me was holding on to it, waiting for the right time to let it guide my next steps. As for Amber, her letters were few and far between. I could tell that the desperation in her words hadn't changed. Even though she, too, was in prison, she still blamed the world, still pointed the finger at everyone but herself. And in some ways, I felt sympathy for her. After all, she was still struggling with the consequences of her actions. But I knew I couldn't carry her weight any longer. One day, I came across an old photograph of Brandon and me, taken when he was a teenager. He had his arm around my shoulders, and we were both smiling, our eyes bright with hope. The photo was a stark reminder of the son I had once known, the son who had been full of potential, who had been a part of a family that loved him unconditionally. That evening, as I sat with my grandson, I felt something stir in me. I wasn't ready to rush into anything, but I also knew that there was something more to this journey than just protecting him from his parents. There was healing to be done, not just for me, but for the entire family. When Brendan finally got out of prison, I wasn't sure what to expect. I had already made my mind that I wasn't going to rush the process of reconciliation. There would be no grand gestures, no easy forgiveness, but there would be a chance for him to prove through his actions that he had truly changed. The first time I saw him again was at the courthouse. He had come to discuss the custody arrangements for his son. The judge, in a rare moment of leniency, had agreed to let Brandon have supervised visits with my grandson. It was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't enough to restore the broken trust between us. When Brandon saw me, his face lit up with the mixture of relief and nervousness. He approached me slowly,
as if unsure of how to greet me, his mother, after everything that had happened. "Mom," he said quietly, almost as if testing the waters. I looked at him for a long moment. The boy that had once been my pride and joy, the man who had almost destroyed everything I held dear. But in that moment, I didn't see the mistakes. I saw the person he could be. I saw the potential for change, for redemption. "Brandon," I said, my voice steady but gentle, "I'm glad to see you're getting the help you need. But it's going to take time. There's a lot to rebuild, a lot of trust to regain." He nodded, his eyes filled with the kind of understanding that hadn't been there before. "I know, Mom. I'm ready to work for it." It wasn't a promise of instant forgiveness. It wasn't a declaration of everything being okay again, but it was a start, a real start. Over the following months, things were slow but steady. Brandon kept his visits with my grandson respectful and careful. He was trying. I could see it. And while I wasn't ready to let him back into my life fully, I couldn't deny that there was progress. He wasn't the same person who had nearly destroyed everything. Amber, on the other hand, wasn't ready to change. Her letters stopped coming, and I eventually stopped checking for them. She had to face her own consequences. Through it all, my grandson remained the constant light in my life. He continued to grow, to learn, and thrive in the secure, loving environment we created for him. His life was full of stability now. No more running away from problems, no more lying to cover up mistakes, just a future full of promise. And me? I had learned to put myself first. I had learned that love didn't mean rescuing people from their own choices. It meant letting them face the consequences of their actions and allowing them to grow from those experiences. In the end, I knew that I had done the right thing, not just for my grandson, but for myself too. I had set boundaries that protected my peace, and that, more than anything, was worth everything.
As the months passed, I began to see subtle changes. Brandon's visits with my grandson were consistent, and there were moments, fleeting but significant, when I saw a glimpse of the son I had once known. The awkwardness at first was understandable. How do you rebuild a relationship after everything has been broken? The answer wasn't easy, and there wasn't a clear roadmap. But with each visit, I could feel Brandon slowly pulling himself out of the pit of desperation he had sunk into during those years of financial struggle. It wasn't just about apologizing, it was about actions. I had made it clear that I wouldn't accept words without seeing the change in his behavior. Actions, not promises. That was the only way forward, and he knew that. I could see the effort he was putting into his visits with his son. He didn't want to make the same mistakes again, and part of me wanted to believe that he was truly trying to be a better person. But a small voice inside me kept reminding me to be cautious, to not rush into something that would put me or my grandson at risk again. My husband, the ever-supportive presence in my life, was wary of Brandon's transformation. He had seen too much, been through too many sleepless nights wondering where this path would lead. But he didn't argue when I told him I thought we needed to give Brandon the space to rebuild. It wasn't about forgiveness yet. It was about allowing the chance for redemption. "What's the worst that could happen?" I had asked him one evening as we sat in the quiet of our living room. "If he's truly changed, we'll see it in time. We don't have to give him everything all at once, but we can give him the opportunity to try." "Ruth, I trust you," he said, though I could see the doubt in his eyes. "But we need to be careful. We can't afford to be hurt like that again. Not after everything." And I understood his fears. I had my own. But what was the point of living in the past? At some point, I had to make peace with the fact that my son was human and that sometimes people had to make their own mistakes before they could truly grow. I could only control so much. What mattered now was whether Brandon could take responsibility for his actions and prove that he was capable of change. It was a hard decision to make. No one ever said healing was easy. One afternoon, I took my grandson to the park. It had become a weekly tradition between us, something simple but filled with warmth. We sat on the grass, watching the children play, their laughter carrying on the wind. As I watched him interact with the other kids, I was struck by how much he had grown. The shy, uncertain boy who had first arrived at our home was now confident, secure in a way I hadn't thought possible given the circumstances he'd been through. He was thriving, and it was the best feeling in the world. "Grandma," he said, breaking my thoughts as he looked up at me, "can we invite Daddy to the park next time?" His innocent question caught me off guard. It wasn't that I hadn't thought about Brandon's relationship with him. It was just that, after everything, I hadn't expected my grandson to be so open to the idea of reconnecting. He still missed his parents, and despite everything, he still wanted them to be part of his life. I felt a pang in my chest. How could I say no to this child who had been through so much and still had such a pure, hopeful heart? How could I deny him the possibility of rebuilding his bond with his father? "Well," I said softly, "I think we can ask your daddy if he's free. We'll have to talk to him first, okay?" He nodded eagerly, his face lighting up with excitement. "That will be great, Grandma. I really miss him." It was a reminder of something I had been avoiding for so long. My grandson wasn't just a victim in this situation. He was a child who wanted to love his parents despite their faults. And as much as I wanted to protect him, I also knew that I had to respect his desire for connection. I had been so focused on my own hurt that I hadn't fully considered his perspective. After that day at the park, I decided to call Brandon. It had been a while since I'd spoken to him directly, and I knew that the time had come for me to extend an olive branch, not just for my sake, but for my grandson's as well. I wasn't ready to invite him back into our lives completely, but I could offer the possibility of healing for the sake of the next generation. "Hello?" Brandon answered on the other end of the line. His voice was tentative, as if he wasn't sure what to expect. "Brandon, it's me," I said, keeping my tone neutral but firm. "I think it's time we talk about moving forward. My grandson wants to see you. He misses you, and he wants to spend time with you." There was silence on the other end for a moment, and then I heard him let out a long, shaky breath. "Are you sure?" His voice cracked slightly, and I could hear the emotion in it. I mean, after everything. "Yes, Brandon, I'm sure. We need to move forward for the sake of our family, but you have to understand that this isn't going to happen overnight. You've made a lot of mistakes, and there's a lot of work to do. You're going to have to prove that you're really committed to changing." "I understand," he said quickly, his voice sincere. "I'm ready. I don't expect it to be easy, but I'm going to do whatever it takes to rebuild that trust. I swear to you, Mom, I won't let you down." It wasn't the grand apology I had expected, but it was enough. His words were cautious, but they were also the first real acknowledgement of his mistakes that I had heard in years. For the first time,
I believed he was trying to change, not just for himself, but for his son. Okay, then, I said, we'll start slow. You can come by the park next Saturday just to meet up with him. We'll take it one step at a time. Thank you, Mom, he replied softly. You have no idea how much this means to me. The day of the park meeting arrived, and as I watched Brandon approach, I felt a mixture of hope and wariness. He stood there, awkwardly at first, as he approached my grandson, who was waiting eagerly by the swings. The two exchanged a few unsure words, but soon enough, my grandson's face lit up with the kind of joy I hadn't seen in a long time. Brandon bent down to give him a hug, and the moment seemed to stretch into eternity. There was still so much to work through, so much trust to rebuild. But in that moment, I saw the first signs of healing. It wouldn't be easy. It would take time, but there was hope for the future. My grandson ran off to play with some of the other kids, and I found myself standing there, watching them both, realizing that the road ahead was long, but it was a road that was finally moving in the right direction. As I watched my grandson and Brandon both tentatively starting to reconnect, I realized that the road ahead wouldn't be perfect, but it was the only road worth taking. Life had a way of throwing obstacles our way, of testing us when we least expected it. But somehow, through all the pain and disappointment, we were still moving forward. Brandon's visits continued to be slow and cautious. My grandson, in his innocence, wanted to believe that everything would go back to the way it was, that his family could be whole again. But for me, I knew that healing was a process, not an instant fix. I needed to see real, lasting change from Brandon before I could fully trust him again. It was the only way to ensure that my grandson was protected from the same mistakes that had caused so much damage before. Brandon, for his part, never gave up. He kept showing up, kept proving that he was committed to being a better father. He was taking responsibility, facing the consequences of his past actions, and slowly, so slowly, regaining the trust I had once given him without hesitation. And as for me, I found peace in the fact that I had set the boundaries I needed, that I had stood firm in the face of overwhelming temptation to let it all go. I had learned that love, when it's truly unconditional, sometimes means making the hardest choices. Sometimes it means saying no when all you want to do is say yes. But in the end, that was the best kind of love, the kind that builds you up, even when it feels like you're tearing something apart. I have no illusions that everything would be easy. I knew there were challenges ahead, moments of doubt, and times when I would question my decisions. But as I watched my grandson grow, as I saw him laughing, playing, and thriving in the life we had built for him, I knew it had all been worth it. The future wasn't set in stone. It would take time. Time for Brandon to fully prove himself, time for me to rebuild my trust, and time for us all to heal. But one thing was certain. We were no longer stuck in the past. We were moving forward, one small step at a time. And as I sat with my grandson that evening, reading him the same stories I had read to Brandon when he was a little boy, I couldn't help but smile. No matter what the future held, we had each other. And in the end, that was all that mattered.